All right. So I guess now you understand what the plan was.
Absolutely. At Colts Law, we talk Indianapolis Colts football.
We're going to stick to what we know, fundamentals and technique, 1% better every day.
What's going on, Colts Nation? I'm Lawrence Owen. With me, as usual, is my guy, Colts Loyalist. And with us today is our old friend, MaxDean. What's going on, man? How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. Thank you for having me back, gentlemen. I love talking about salary cap, financials. I appreciate that you guys keep bringing me back to do that. And the Colts are always an interesting one to talk about. So I'm ready. I'm ready to get into it.
Absolutely. I just want to take a real quick moment. As Loyalist said in the chat, please don't forget to smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're not subscribed, tag that notification bell so that you are notified next time we go live or upload a video. And John, you're so funny, dude. I love this. The Colts are like Oprah. You get 20 million and you get 20 million and you get 20 million. It wasn't like that previously, but apparently now it is because everybody wants to get paid. And let's face it, there's only so much money to go around due to the salary cap that the NFL, levies on each and every of the 32 teams. So we can't pay everybody every dime that they want. So we got to kind of look at it. What is each player worth? Who can we afford to keep around? Who are we looking at going, well, they want too much money. Maybe they should be taking the dirt road out of town. Well, that's why we brought MaxDean in, because this is exactly what we need to talk about. So, Max, as you look at the Indianapolis Colts right now, their salary cap situation, they talk about cash versus cap and that they like to run more cash than they do, working the cap itself. What are your thoughts on the makeup of how they have, to this point, worked the cap and kept themselves in the situation that they are in?
So, first thing is the Colts are a team that do tend to go more in the cash to cap plan. And essentially what that means, I talked a couple of years ago about how you can use signing bonuses and special kinds of guaranteed bonuses to pay a player, but kind of push some of the cap charges into the future for your team. The Colts are a team that doesn't really like to do that. They really do their best to keep their cap essentially the same as the amount of money that they pay in a given year. And there's two reasons for this. First of all, it does limit dead money, which is what our cap charges that you have for a player that's no longer on the roster. But also the Colts are not one of the bigger spenders in the NFL. They tend to spend less in cash on an annual basis than a lot of other teams in the league. So by making this like your known clear strategy, you have a little bit more wiggle room when you're having negotiations with players. So you say, hey, look, we do cash to cap. That's how we operate. So when they're talking to the agents, they say, we have $12 million in cap space left. So we're not going to be spending more than $12 million, in terms of money this year on you. So there are a lot of opinions on what's the right way to do things, but that is what the Colts look like right now. So as we talk about different players going forward, I'll kind of tell you, if they stick to this mold, if they stick to this strategy, this is what they can afford to do. This is what they'll be able to do. And then I'll also throw out what they would potentially be able to do if they at least divert a little bit from that. Because there have been teams that have really lived by that and then started to change things more recently. So I'll kind of give you both sides of it.
So whenever this is happening and stuff, okay, and like you said, they have their slotted amount and stuff. Does that make it harder, like with the Kenny Moore situation? Basically, the cap had been allocated and we knew where everything was going. We had the Quenton Nelson contract, and then Kenny Moore comes up and is asking. Does that make it harder for them to fill that need, his financial requests and stuff, and make it harder to negotiate those type of deals?
It does make it more challenging because let me put it this way: Chris Ballard and Frank Reich are not the ones saying let's do this. It's not their money. They're like, hey, let's go get more players. So this is an ownership decision. I know that Irsay wants to win, but it's also his decision on what the budget for his roster and franchise are. So yes, it does make it more challenging for Chris Ballard to have those kinds of negotiations. I will say this. You will not really ever have a player wait until June, or I'm not sure exactly when news broke this to the public. You'll never have a player wait till June and be like, hey, I want to get paid. This is a conversation that's been ongoing for a long time, and it's now becoming public because the Colts have not gotten to the number that he's looking for. I will say that. So it is more challenging, but it's also not a surprise by any stretch.
Okay. And you were talking about diverting a little bit, from the cash to cap to the other. Is that a situation when you're looking at a team that has is that something because a team has drafted well and they've gotten a bunch of good players and now you kind of gotta lean in toward future money in order to keep those guys? Is that what you're saying the Colts might have to do in order to keep some of these?
In a way, yes, because I think it is advisable to step away from the pure cash to cap model that they've mostly done. They've done it in very, very small amounts, like very small. So they've done it with Matt Ryan. They converted a small amount of his salary this year I don't remember the exact details. Either they did a small amount of it or because his roster bonus was guaranteed, it automatically does that. There are a few different types of bonuses that have that kind of proration effect. But regardless, they have it in a small amount with Matt Ryan. They could have changed that if they wanted to and kept it pure cash to cap, but they didn't. And I believe they've done it to a small degree with DeForest Buckner as well. So some of those more expensive guys they have, but it's like they've done it without looking at the actual numbers and calculating. They've done it probably 10% of what they could do, even for those players alone. And they haven't done it for everybody. So I would say it's advisable if you do have a good roster of homegrown players that you know what they are, you know what kind of character they have, and they're successful in your scheme. It's not so advisable if you're going out there and using that technique to buy a whole bunch of free agents because you don't know what kind of person they are, at least not, physically you get to see that every single day. You don't truly know how they're going to mesh with the locker room, how they're going to fit in your scheme. So I do think that there's a time and a place for it. And personally, my opinion would be that the Colts should, depending on how this year goes, because we'll talk about some of the other stuff in a minute, but depending on how this year goes, I think that should absolutely be something in the back of their mind. If they want to keep this team together that they have spent time assembling and really be competitive, they probably would need to do that, at least to some degree.
Absolutely. I think you're probably, especially in the next upcoming, not maybe this year so much, but next year when you got some rather large names that have been drafted like a Jonathan Taylor or a Michael Pittman Jr., guys like that, where they're going to want their extensions at that point, after their third season. And there's not going to be a lot of money to be given around, even though we are hearing, we have known for the last couple years that next year the salary cap should go up a little bit, right?
It will go up. So the cap is based on the overall revenue for the league. It's a long convoluted calculation, but essentially it goes up in relation to the overall revenue of the league. So as league revenue continues to climb every single year, so does the cap. Now, there was a major issue with that with the COVID year, with no ticket sales, and not just the ticket sales, all of the revenue that's earned in the actual stadiums themselves for food, parking, so on and so forth. Personal seat license fees and all that stuff, that all had to get pushed out. So they lost a ton of money. And in order to keep the cap from going down to where it really would be, like what the actual ratio would have been, they said, okay, look, we will artificially keep the cap higher, but we're going to keep it artificially lower for the next couple of years to recuperate that money. So the overall ratio stays the same, but they just futzed with it a little bit to make sure that the cap didn't drop to a level that would completely screw up the entire league in the roster situation. So It will go up a little bit next year, but it's really going to go up a lot in 2024. That's what's expected. So overthecap.com has a great tool that projects cap space based on what they expect the cap to be next year. And if you take into account the rollover from this year, I calculated that the Colts are looking at about $35.5 million in cap space next year without making any releases, trades, new signings, and so on and so forth. So that's not bad, but like you said, in relation to the number of players who would be looking for an extension, you're going to need to mess with it a little bit. If you want me to talk a little bit about some of the players that are upcoming, I'm sure that you and your fans know who most of them are, but the first one obviously is this year's Quenton Nelson, because he's in the final year of his contract. It's the 5th-year option after being drafted in the first round. You always have the franchise tag as a possibility. Guards don't usually get the franchise tag, but he is definitely good enough that he would warrant it. The only thing about that is it's a flat number. There's really nothing you can do with it, and unless you negotiate a new contract, then it is what it is. And that would probably be somewhere, without researching, I'm guessing it's probably somewhere in the $13 to $14 million range, which is around what he is. He's definitely a player worthy of more annually, though. So I would expect him to be looking at a contract extension probably at some point this summer. You guys would know more about any updates to that than I do at this moment. The other one that you got to think about this year is Yannick Ngakoue. So he was traded for Rock Ya-Sin, which I think was a really nice move. The only thing is that he was signed to a relatively short-term deal with the Raiders, and so this is the last year of his deal coming up. So when you're just looking a year out, both of those guys are probably key players that will be nearing, or that will be approaching free agency. I would expect Quenton Nelson to get signed. Yannick Ngakoue, I have no idea, but what I will say is that if I were the Colts, I would monitor closely how effective he is in their defense, which he's been with Gus Bradley many times before. If he's having a good early season, if he's playing well in that first month, I would go to his agent and try and get something done in that first part of the year, because otherwise it's just another player that you're going to have to try and retain approaching free agency. I think the best organizations are proactive. Now, I don't want to do anything before I know what he looks like in the defense, but I would be keeping a close eye on that and considering bringing him back as your key rotational edge rusher, because it just keeps you from having another hole in the future. Do you guys have any questions about those two players before I jump on to the next year, guys?
It's funny. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm just saying, I said pretty much the exact same thing about Yannick. I said, obviously, you if he's as good as advertised as he has been in the past, you want to extend him, but you don't know if he is going to be the same with your team. Yes, he's got the same, defensive mind that's coaching him, but not the exact same players around him, and you never know. And I said, watch for that. Possibly try to get him an extension after the first few games of the year, see how he's working out. It was very interesting that you brought up the exact same point. Loyalist?
Yeah, also, I just wanted to mention that, you'd mentioned using the franchise tag. And if I kicked around that idea last month about it, but the thing was I just don't want to. You don't want to piss Quenton Nelson off. You don't want to. Yeah. That way. But I mean, just from a business aspect, you don't want to sit there because he is such a culture setter.
Yes.
And the Colts also have only used the franchise tag twice since the creation of the franchise tag. So they don't use it very much at all. So I guess if you were to sit there and do you have these conversations? Is there already conversations you think taking place with Yannick's representation? Obviously there will be with Cuba. Do you think that you go ahead and start conversations now before the season, or do you think that it is something that you have to put eyes on?
I think it's one of those things where his agent after the trade probably reached out to the Colts and asked, kind of tossed around the potential idea. But I mean, again, this is based on what I would do, but also what I think they would do. The Colts probably said, look, we're happy to have him. We're going to see how things go. No numbers are actually offered, anything like that. Okay. When it's a player like this, who hasn't had a long-term deal yet in his career, sometimes those players are kind of like, okay, at this point, I've been bouncing around from team to team. I would like to stay in one place for a while if I like it here. And then I want that big signing bonus. I want the guaranteed money. Like, I want to know that I can play the rest of the season without being afraid of getting hurt and losing out on that. Because approaching free agency has its benefits too. You can have multiple teams potentially trying to vie for your services, but also you could get hurt in December and essentially miss out on free agency. And so since he didn't get a big payday last year when he was a free agent, he might be amenable to getting something done quickly. So I do believe that there's a scenario in which they say, hey, it's 3 or 4 weeks into the season, probably about 4 weeks into the season. We like what we have with Yannick, and he plays well with he fits well with our defensive line. This is what we're looking at. And ultimately, it's the agent's job to talk to the player and have his input so he can advise him. But if Yannick says, let's do it, let's get it done, I don't want to think about it anymore, that's kind of the way that you would do that. So it's hard for me to estimate exactly what he would earn, depends on how impactful he is. But my guess is you would have to be looking at something like 15 a year, probably 15 maybe 17.5, something like that. I don't think he's a $20 million a year guy, but that's my opinion on it.
Wow. If you got that kind of number on Yannick, what kind of number you got on Quenton?
Well, the guard market is capped off at about 16.5 million right now. So pass rushers make a lot more. So a tier 2 pass rusher could potentially even make more than a tier 1 guard. It's just the way that it works. Quenton Nelson will, once he signs a new contract, he will 100% be the highest paid guard in football, no question. So for a long-term contract, I would expect to pay him at about 17 million per year. Right now, there's a lot of Colts fans that's thinking that he could end up pushing 20.
No, because you have to work off of the market that already exists. You can't be an offensive tackle and say, I want 30 million a year. Well, like, no one will pay you that. So, it doesn't really matter what you want, but the highest paid guard right now, I think, is Brandon Scherf. I believe he beat out Joe Tooney this offseason, and he's at about 16.5 or so, maybe 16.75 maybe, or 16.25. He beat out the previous mark by about $250,000 per year. So Quenton Nelson is, like, if not the best, he's in the top 2 or 3 best guards in football, and he's been that for a long time. He's a franchise player. He's a tone setter. I would estimate about 17 million for him. There's no other guard that's going to bring the market up before he gets paid, so that's my projection on what you would expect for him.
You were talking earlier about how this cap is going to explode in 24 and 25. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a bargaining chip where, some of these fringe players, because I remember last year when we talked, you said that the Colts are getting into that area where they're going to have to make some tough decisions, and some of them that aren't going to feel so good, and we had talked about losing AWalk, a couple of years ago, but now we're sort of finding ourselves in another scenario with Bobby Okereke, who my question is, do you think that you could sit there and say, hey, you fit in with our locker room, this is all working great, why don't you do a 2-year, a shorter contract with us, stay with the team, wait for that salary cap to really explode? And, I mean, is that a bargaining chip that you could use to get these guys to try to double dip? Because, like I said, Bobby O, he would be 27 or 28 if he did that, and he would be able to get another contract and stuff.
In a hypothetical world, you could throw it out there, but I don't think that it's going to have a lot of impact. So Bobby Okereke is a guy that I didn't include, honestly, and I'm sorry to say this because I just don't think there's any chance that you guys get him back. I think he's on his way. And so I was looking, and you can always tell where a team is a bit weak, where they sign a bunch of undrafted free agents. You guys signed like 20-something. You guys went hard. But I noticed that you had a bunch of linebacker UDFAs, and I was like, that's weird because they have so many good linebackers. And then I was like, oh, but 2 of them are going to be gone after this year. And they have one who's the highest paid linebacker in football. So they're like, look,
we know we're not paying any other linebackers anytime soon. We need to find some cheap guys who could play. So they brought in 4 to training camp, and they're hoping at least one of those guys can play out of that. So, I mean, that's like the writing on the wall to me. He's an awesome player, but I just look, everything I say, take with a grain of salt. I could be wrong. I can't read minds, but based on the way that I say, I just don't think there's any way Bobby O's back. I think he's going to be a quality free agent. If a guy like Foye Oluokan's making 15 with the Jags a year, he's like, look, I'm going to have a good year, and if you guys can't do that for me, somebody will. Yeah. So, or at least close to that. So I like him, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I'm sorry.
Them darn Jags, they're always running. I mean, they did it with the wide receiver market this year. You know, they're like, oh, we'll reset this thing. I don't care what.
Yeah, you know, that's funny, but I can talk about that too. But it depends. Do you want me to keep going with some of the Colts players coming up?
Yeah, let's keep going with the Colts. Hold on one quick moment. We're 21 minutes in, so I want to thank everybody for joining here and watching. If you have any questions, drop it in the chat. Let us know your thoughts if you watch us later in the comments below. But don't forget, if you're interested in helping supporting the channel, you could do it for free by hitting the like button, or you could help us out with the donations. So there's a link right there in the description of the video. You could also go check out Max over on Twitter. There's a link to his Twitter. Go give him a follow. And check out my merch shop. Come check out the Colts Law merch shop. New items added every week. All sorts of items. From clothing to cups to cozies to backpacks, hats, just miscellaneous items that you can get around the house, even phone covers. Just check it out. Let me know. Send me a message. Hey, is there something that I'm missing? Go feel free to ask. Have a good one. Yeah, that was a terrible recording. I'm going to have to re-record that. Oh, my goodness. I did that in one take, and I was like, okay, I got enough time now. I got to go and do something else real quick. So I'm going to have to spend some time re-recording that. That was awful. Oh, my goodness. I sound better if I was talking about curling, and I have no idea what that. But yeah, let's talk about some more Colts guys.
Okay. So the interesting thing about the Colts is that they have what I project, and again, we'll get back to the Kenny Moore conversation maybe in a minute, but when I was looking at the roster prior to us talking, there were 5 guys that popped up to me as pretty important players that I wouldn't really want to let go if I was this team trying to stay competitive in the years to come. And one is a big if. One there's a big question mark. The other ones I'm kind of confident with. That would be Matt Ryan, Jonathan Taylor, Michael Pittman Jr., Kenny Moore, and Julian Blackmon. So those are all, to me, key pieces of the offense and defense, respectively. You have 2 years left of Matt Ryan, 2 years left of all these guys. Ryan is obviously a big question because you just don't know what he's going to be like coming over. Look, we all know what Matt Ryan's heights are. You never know when a quarterback's age kind of catches up with him. I mean, we've seen guys that were basically more or less still in their prime one year, and the next year, there's clearly a decline. And sometimes that's not something that you can really see until the full season plays out, until they're playing December, January football, and hopefully February too. But that's a guy to keep in mind, that if you want to keep Matt Ryan and retain this core roster that you have, I just have a hard time seeing how you do that without diverting from the cash to cap strategy. Now, if you decide that you're going in a different direction and you decide that you're going to draft a quarterback or something like that, then maybe that's a different conversation. Maybe it becomes easier because you do get a little bit more space with the younger player. But if Matt Ryan is good and you guys do want to retain him for a while, quarterbacks of his age generally have a going rate of around $25 million. So that's something to keep in mind. Jonathan Taylor at the running back position, I would say the best in the league right now. And it would be hard not to pay him unless he totally has a completely injury-ridden season this year. And even then it's tough because he's just so impactful. Running backs, that's been kind of a weird one because the market kind of capped off with Christian McCaffrey, and no one, even the best in the league, are not getting that. So it's tough. It depends on. I think this is one where it just depends on what he's willing to accept, because you could get him for similar to the Derrick Henry 12.5 deal, 12.5 million per year, or you could have him really trying to push that market to 16.5 or something like that. Michael Pittman Jr., this is a big one. I think that if he continues to progress in the trajectory that he has over the first 2 years, he's clearly a $20+ million player. Now, that depends. If with a new quarterback, Matt Ryan, coming in, he doesn't kind of say, I'm clearly a number one wide receiver in the league, then maybe he does hang out at that secondary market that's just below 20 million per year, where the guys like Christian Kirk are. But as a true X, as a guy that I expect to get the most targets by far on the Colts offense, if it's a successful offense, I have a hard time seeing him not trying to push that market that's going to be in the 25 million per year. Then Kenny Moore, we talked about that briefly before the show, but as a nickel primary guy, if he wants to set the market as one of the better nickels in the league, he'd be looking at about 11, 12 million. That hasn't really gone up dramatically. The funny thing about the nickel position is that even though it's become a starting position, it still is a difficult position to match up with anyone that will go into the slot. So if you have a big wide receiver, even a guy like a Michael Pittman, or you're playing a big guy like an Evan Ingram, then it can be tough for a smaller 5'9" guy to match up with that consistently. He's definitely physical in the run game, but sometimes physicality is not enough. Let's be honest, is he going to hold up against Mo Alley Cox, like a guy like that size? He doesn't really have that skill set consistently. So even though it's an important position, you always have to realize that you're going to have time split between whoever's playing either the nickel or that third linebacker or that nickel safety. So like the big nickel guy, you're always going to have substitutions there more than almost anywhere else on the defense. Most of the other guys play all the time. So I understand he may want more money, but that's kind of what the market dictates now. And then Julian Blackmon, I think he's a really good player. So he could be probably looking at anywhere from 12 to 15 or 16 per year.
Wow. So
you guys have a lot of players who are going to be legitimate earners on the free agent market. And based on that $35.5 million mark in cap space that I mentioned, that's totally not viable, right? To just live within that cash to cap world. So those are the tough decisions I was talking about having to make in the coming years. You're kind of holding it together now, but the time will come next year, and you've already kind of skirted some of that stuff by, looking at the roster right now, the Colts are clearly expecting significant contributions from a second and third round rookie on the offense this year. And so even if that goes well, if it goes well, great, but you don't know, you never know what that's going to be like. So those are the players that I think need to be decided on in the next 12 months, basically. If you decided you didn't want to extend any of those guys, a lot of them would be back next year, but they will all be vocal about wanting new contracts. Some of them will be requesting trades if you're not amenable to fulfilling those contract requests. And, you'll have to make determinations. Or is it worth getting draft picks back and trying to keep the roster super young but relatively unknown, or do we want to invest? Because as it stands right now, you guys have basically in the top of the draft a first, second, and third, and a potential for a first and 2 seconds, depending on how the Carson Wentz playing time ends up playing out in Washington. So, with $35.5 million in space and essentially a 1 and 2 twos or a 1 and a 2 and a 3, it's perfectly fine, but it's going to be tough to necessarily fully replenish the stock of players that you have right now. So those are my thoughts. But, you know, in terms of what other positions that you might need to replace, depending on how it all shakes out, I can mention in a minute. But do you guys have any other questions about specific players and why they earn so much, or what I think the Colts should do, or anything like that?
Just like you were talking about with this offensive line, okay, you know, we've got Ryan Kelly, Quenton Nelson soon to get paid. Braden Smith just recently got paid. And we always talk about, excuse me, having this massive percentage of our total salary cap wrapped up into this O-line and stuff, you know. Where, I mean, do these teams, do they set limits for these rooms, or is it just strictly a player by player based, you know, make decision?
Yeah, some do. It depends, because, like, for example, I mean, I look at you having one linebacker who's the highest paid in the league, and I can tell you right now, they're saying there's no way that we're making financial investment in another linebacker. But offensively, if you do roll with Matt Ryan, that's an aging quarterback who will be a little bit less mobile every single year, and it's already like the identity of your offense to have that monstrous offensive line. So it's hard to say, look, like, you're one of the best centers in the NFL, but we can't afford you anymore, because it's a key part of it. I think something that would go a long way is if Bernhard Raimann comes right in and he's like, I'm a beast. Like, I'm the guy at left tackle. That would go a long way, because then you could say, look, we still have a stud left tackle, stud right tackle, stud guard, and then we can work on the other two positions maybe in the draft. But especially because right guard, you have a couple of guys who might be good. I think, you know, between Pinner and Fries, right? Those are the guys that are vying for the right guard spot. So, you know, I think that would go a long way. Conversely, if Raimann doesn't show what you're looking for, which I like Raimann, so I think he's going to be good, but rookie offensive linemen are always sketchy. But if he's not what you think you were getting with that third round pick, not only do you need to find a left tackle, it also makes it pretty hard to release one of those other offensive linemen or trade one of those other offensive linemen, specifically Ryan Kelly. So I think there's a world in which it's viable, but it's tough for me knowing that it's the identity of your offense, you know? And it's one of those things we've seen running backs before, like, no matter how good they are, if they're getting tackled behind the line of scrimmage, they don't really get that opportunity to make guys miss in the open field. You know, if they have to make a guy miss a yard behind the line, then it's hard for them to focus on who's coming from the defensive backfield and set up their blocks and make guys miss there. So that's one of the questions about paying a running back big money, you know?
Yeah. So it's going to go.
No, if you,
real quick, it's going to be hard to get that third contract from the Colts. It sounds like you might get a second contract, but to sit there and get a third contract with the path that they're on, like you said, drafting so well and having these top 5, top 10 players at their position stuff, it's going to be almost impossible to get a third contract in long.
Well, it depends on the position, and it depends on how good the player is. It depends on the position, because, like, a lot of positions, you really can only expect to get a second good contract from any team, just because linebackers, they don't tend to play well past like 30, 31. Cornerbacks, they fall off a cliff after, most of them fall off a cliff after like 30, 31. Then offensive linemen, they tend to play longer. Quarterbacks tend to play. It depends. I will say this, though. If the Colts are willing to use some proration, that 2024 TV money and return to like proper earnings to cap ratio, then they have the opportunity to like keep their roster very competitive for the next few years. It's all about being willing to spend that money. So if you want to start lobbying Jim Irsay on Twitter, now's the time. Like, let him know that we want this roster kept together.
Well, here's the thing, though. If they do that, if they do prorate some of this into the 2024 and beyond, that's going to limit how much money they have to spend on those times during free agency. Right? They will be kind of stuck on, we have to build through the draft now. We're kind of limited there now. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, if they decide to use the proration method, let's say they don't do that at all this year. Let's say they've got about 12 million right now, if I remember right. So
Yeah.
that's enough. That's enough to extend Quenton Nelson. And then if they so choose, it's enough to also give Kenny Moore a few $1 million raise. And they don't even have to mess with their cash to cap method this year. It also leaves them enough room in season for those. It leaves them enough cap space in season for those various moves you make for the practice squad and all that stuff. Then once you
but if they do that, I just said do again. If they do that, that both those signings, there's zero chance that they will get a free agent wide receiver because they won't have no money, right?
Yeah, that's pretty unlikely. But again, this is something I always want to point out, and this is something I said about the Titans last year. Fans always want to add that final piece in training camp because it's so enticing, but how often does it ever really make any impact?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're signing a guy in free agency now, you shouldn't be signing a guy for more than a couple of $1 million anyway. So they would still be able to do it. Maybe not the kind of guy you're talking about, but like I wouldn't go anywhere near Julio Jones if I were you guys. I mean,
or OBJ or TY
Look, first of all, OBJ is not even ready to play.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of guy that you sign maybe in season. But if Ty's willing to come back for a low contract, fine. But I wouldn't, guys. Like right now, you have two tight ends who are returning. You've got two tight ends who you drafted. You've got Jonathan Taylor. You got Nyheim Hines. You've got Paris Campbell, and you've got Michael Pittman Jr. So I think the Colts have pretty obviously set up their offense to depend more on the run game, tight ends, and their number one receiver than really their number two guy. So if you got Alec Pierce out there and he's just running go routes all day and he's just continuously taking the top off the defense and making them be honest, making them, trying to keep that safety, paying attention to him, then honestly, I don't think that there is a need for you guys to sign a wide receiver. Now, look, if Michael Pittman gets hurt partway through the year, you do need to be cognizant of bringing in a guy, maybe an OBJ when he's more healthy. You got to hope that doesn't happen. But in terms of the way that the talent and roster is structured, I think that Matt Ryan is really good at divvying up the ball. I mean, Jonathan Taylor got a boatload of receptions last year. Nyheim Hines is a receiving running back, and Michael Pittman is going to eat up touches too. So it's like I don't really think you need to spend that money. That's just my opinion, though. That's what I think. Know who you are,
Yeah.
That's awesome that you're talking about that because there are so many Colts fans out there that are just like, we have nothing behind Michael Pittman Jr. because, it's nice, Alec Pierce, but we don't know what he's going to be like in the NFL, and Paris Campbell can't stay healthy, and so they're like that. I think I've said multiple times, hey, there's a lot of guys that are young on this team that haven't gotten the experience, haven't gotten the touches. Let's see what they can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's my thought process on it. But I'm sorry for cutting you off of where you were going before the wide receiver thought. Please continue.
Well, it's just one of those things where it's like, to me, adding depth is not about going out and finding a 32-year-old guy and paying him $10 million. Like, that's not adding depth. Adding depth is finding guys that may have not found a home yet and signing them for $1 to $3 million, if you feel like he's a good fit for your offense. And again, it's just like Matt Ryan is really good at distributing the ball. Just don't feel like you're going to have two 1,000-yard receivers this year. That's just not who you're going to be. And that's fine. I think when you combine everything that they have a plan in place. And going up against a lot of teams who are running cover two, or not cover two, but too high all the time, because you've got the Josh Allens and you've got the Patrick Mahomes and the Justin Herberts. You're going to force those defenses to play differently versus you than they do against all the others. It's one of the reasons I was fine with the Jets and the Jets, the Ravens, and the Colts really emphasizing the run game, because that differentiates you from what everybody else is doing, just doing the same thing, you know? So look, I can't tell you if they're going to make the playoffs or not, but I do think that they have a viable plan in place. Now, the real question I have is the left tackle position, because you never know. The other one for me that's big, and we didn't talk about the defense much yet, is for this year, corner. I'm worried about corner for you guys because, like I said, you signed. Let's see. I made a note.
Gilmore.
You signed Gilmore, but I mean, he's gonna be 32 essentially at the beginning of the season, and he's had injury issues. You know, he didn't play for like, I don't know how. I feel like it was almost 2 years that he was not playing. He missed a lot of 2020 and then 2021. He finally was activated off PUP like halfway through the year. He's your number one corner right now. Mm-hmm. You've got Isaiah Rodgers, and then you drafted a guy. Now the good news is you do have a pretty good safety and nickel group of guys, but like I would not be focusing on wide receiver for all the Colts fans out there. I would be like, what are we gonna do at corner if Stephon Gilmore is injured or he can't play up to what we were hoping for, or because of age or whatever the case. And you guys know it better than me. I mean, I didn't keep close tabs on Isaiah Rodgers last year. How does he look for you guys? Do you feel like confident in him being a starting player?
Yes, I like Isaiah Rodgers myself personally. You know, he's definitely got that speed, that makeup speed and stuff. You know what I mean? But he's always in decent position.
He's been burnt a few times on double moves. That's the only thing that I have really harsh on Rodgers is he can get caught. He talks about the makeup speed. He needs it a lot, right? That's my problem. But then again, he's young, you know. So this year he could really, you know, maybe if he ties to the hip to a guy like Gilmore and, you know, learn a little bit from him, that might help out a lot. We also picked up Brandon Facyson from the Raiders. I know he's not a number one outside corner, but kind of like that whole TJ Carey thing that they picked up, you know, that just in case kind of guy, you know. They're not looking – I don't think the Colts really focus heavily or have not focused heavily on outside cornerbacks very, very often. They are more – because of the scheme that that zone scheme, that's more of a I don't know, unless Gus does it differently, because Matt Eberflus was more of a play it as a blanket as a team rather than one-on-one type situation. So I don't know how that's going to work out this year. It is a worry for me as well.
Well, the Eberflus did more too high stuff. He did a lot more too high stuff. And Bradley is known for being primarily a cover 3-1 high guy. And he took that from the Seahawks back in the Carroll days, the Legion of Boom defense, ended up in Jacksonville, and then been moving around ever since. But the defensive scheme does change a little bit. Now, I do agree that if you're going to choose, you do need to prioritize defensive line. You guys have a good one, I think. You're hoping for more from second-year guys like Odiengbo, Pay, but I think you guys have talent there. I would say that, though, like if there's one position that I do fear would hold you guys back in the long run, and especially you get through the AFC South, not the strongest division, you go to the playoffs. Might be a bit challenging to be a real contender once you get there, and you do have to go up against the Stephon Diggs of the AFC. When you do have to go up against, you know, whoever else it might be. I mean, you know, with the Chiefs, I know they don't have necessarily their number one guy anymore, but like when you have a guy who can move around and throw guys open like Mahomes, like that's the thing I would point out as a potential question mark for them. So looking at what else you would be looking at going forward in the next year or so. Obviously, they're more than likely going to get that left guard position tacked down now. I do believe that they will need to address the defensive end position.
because you do need rotational rushers. So even if best case scenario, both Odeyingbo and Pay both work out, you're still probably going to need a third guy. So that's kind of why I'm thinking about getting in early. Linebacker, once Okereke goes, and EJ Speed, he's another guy. I think that his contract expires after this year. So you have Zaire Franklin. And again, because you can save a little bit of money even potentially with him, he might be a guy that they move on from next year if they want to finagle things that way. And then corner, because even though it's a 2-year contract, I just have a hard time believing that you can go into 2023 with your number one corner being Stephon Gilmore, who's going to be 33 years old. I just think that's tough. So some of those might kind of work themselves out, but they're just things to keep in mind. And then quarterback, we'll see how Matt Ryan is. Wide receiver, again, there's definitely a pathway where you don't have to worry about it almost at all, but there's also a pathway where you're like, okay, we need to address this next year. Left tackle is the same thing. If you see what you like out of those two rookies, great. If not, that's something else you have to look at. Right guard, if you have a loaded offensive line, then one right guard whose average is probably fine. I imagine you can get that between Pinner or Fries, but you never know. Like, that's what I thought about Greg Van Roten, and obviously that didn't work out for the Jets at all. So a truly weak link on the offensive line can do you in no matter how good the other guys are. You need at least a decent guy. Nickel, if they decide to pay Kenny Moore or move on from him, then that either fixes itself or you're looking for another guy to play that role. And safety, because of Blackmon, you drafted a safety in, I think, the 3rd round, Nick Cross. He's a guy I was interested in as well. But again, anytime you're talking about rookies, you just never know. If everything goes well, you got Cross and Blackmon as your starters next year. But sometimes you have to go out and try and fix that. So with that in mind, if everything goes great, you're still going to have to make some tough choices. If some things don't go well, it's going to be pretty challenging. And then I think the last thing that I'll throw at you guys, just to kind of keep in mind as you're looking forward to next year, and I'll let you ask any other questions, are the possible cap savings for some of the guys that if you wanted to release them or trade them, this is what you would open up in space if you want to prioritize somebody like a Michael Pittman. Stephon Gilmore, I do expect to be released more than likely. He will save you almost 10 full million in space. So that 35.5 would almost immediately go up to 45.5. So again, you will have to address the corner position, but I think the $10 million will probably be better spent elsewhere. Grover Stewart, he's a dude at nose tackle I love. But again, sometimes you have to ask yourself, can I find another run-stuffing defensive tackle? If I can save a little over $9 million by trading him or releasing him. Ryan Kelly I have on here as well, because you, just like you brought up, Loyalist, you would save 7.875 if you decided to trade him. I'm sure you could find a buyer for a good center. Kenny Moore, next year he would save you 7.75 million if you decided to trade him elsewhere. And if you guys, for whatever reason, can't come to terms with the contract, if you traded him this year, you'd save 6.25 and plus the additional 7.75 next year. So if he were to be gone now, that would save you, almost $14 million or $14 million overall because of the way the rollover works. Naheem Hines, 3.29. He's a nice piece. He's still relatively cheap. So as long as he doesn't get hurt, I don't think he'd go, but you never know if they're really trying to open up every single penny they can. Mo Alley Cox, if one of your rookies plays really, really well, he'd save you almost $3 million. Rigoberto Sanchez, if you want to get cheaper at kicker, he saves you almost $3 million. Nick Foles, he does have some guaranteed money, but $2.1 million he'd free up, and Zaire Franklin would save you 2.1 as well. So these are all possibilities if you are trying to open up some space for those key guys, those building block pieces, without converting away or diverting away from your cash to cap methodology that they largely use. So just keeping all of that in mind, either you're going to have to make some real decisions, you're going to have to divert, or you're going to have to hope everything just goes extremely well with the rookies that you drafted. And as good of a drafting team as the Colts are, you always have a 2017 draft mixed in there somewhere where it's not atrocious, but you didn't really get what you were looking for out of that class. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I'm curious. Now, obviously, you're not saying that we need to trade all these guys. It's just
No.
options out there, in case Ballard needs to move some money around and maybe get draft picks. My question is, when it comes to the end of someone's contract and they're playing on their final year, right? And you're like, there's no way we can afford this dude. Is it better to trade them or let them play themselves out, get a contract from a different team the following year, and then get a compensatory pick? I have a hard time with that, so I have to say it really slow.
It's a really good question, and there's no single answer for every player. It's going to depend on a lot of things. Like, one is the compensatory system. It's based entirely on how much you sign from how much you spend in signing from other teams versus how much you're spending, how much you're losing of your players who are signing with other teams. So it's like, okay, we can't afford you because we need to go sign a corner. Well, if you're going to sign a $16 million a year corner and you're letting a play, like, just for example, a guy like, let's say you let Julian Blackmon go. He becomes an even better player this year. He goes out and signs for $14 million. Well, you completely offset whatever you would get back from him. So that's something to keep in mind. Do you expect to be spending on outside free agents coming in? Because if you do, then maybe you want to trade him now and actually get something in draft compensation back. The other thing is, do we have anybody viable to replace you if we decide to trade you now? Because if you don't, then, if you plan on being competitive, then sending a guy away who you put in a jag to replace, then, that's something to consider. So, I mean, ideally you can do something like the 49ers did, except that he stays healthy, where you trade away a guy like DeForest Buckner, you get draft compensation back, you can immediately address that need with a cheaper player in the draft. Hopefully Javon Kinlaw would stay healthy, but like, ideally that's what you would do, because you will never get a first round pick in compensatory. So if it's a good player, that's something to keep in mind, and a player to come in and replace it. And then again, if you're going to be spending on outside free agents, will you get anything back from that anyway? So, there's no single answer, but it could be different for every single situation.
Absolutely. Before you ask any questions, Loyalists, I just want to take a real quick break because we're almost at an hour now, and so it's about over with. Please smash that like button, share to your favorite social media, and go check out the Backroom Collection. They got great stuff. Do it now!
This channel is proudly sponsored by the Backroom Collection. They do beautiful sports canvas art with football, basketball, baseball, and other sports themes. Special orders are accepted and autograph pieces are available. Many Indianapolis Colts signed pieces will be available beginning in November. Just use your discount code CL10 to purchase the pieces you want to spice up your living area. That's CL10.
DeForest and I are going to have a discussion. You don't tell people just to go and check that out right now in the middle of my stream. That's not cool, dude. All right. All right. So, Loyalist, any final questions or words that you have?
Just for Drunken Master, he asked, he said, did he say Buckner? He was using it as an example. He wasn't saying that we had to get rid of DeForest Buckner.
No, he's my favorite player. I would be so mad. He's my favorite player on the Colts, man. I'd be so mad at Ballard. But yeah, I get you.
I don't think that he's a guy that you would move on from. He's a cornerstone piece. He's in his prime. I'm not sure exactly what he heard me saying, but I was talking about
what the
ideal way to do it is what the 49ers did, is get him to a team, get immediate compensation, and then fill that spot. I wasn't suggesting that the Colts move on from Buckner. No worries.
I'm right there with you, Drunken Master. Right there with you. Any final thoughts, Max, before we end up ending this one?
I just, I think the Colts are a really interesting team. They were thrown into a difficult situation with the retirement for Andrew Luck, and I feel like they've never quite been able to say, like, this is our path ever since then. They've kind of been a little bit reactionary ever since, and it's really the best that they could do, Like, for example, I don't think they spend a top 10 pick on a guard if Andrew Luck is not their quarterback, right? Like, and I'm not saying that it's a bad pick. I'm not saying anything else, but you probably would have been able to address a key position like a younger offensive tackle or a corner or a pass rusher or whatever earlier. Like, everything's been kind of pushed off just a little bit because they thought they had that in place. That doesn't happen. They haven't gone all in on finding a quarterback elsewhere. I feel like they got so lucky to get Matt Ryan. Like, that's something we didn't even talk about at all, any of their previous moves. But, like, getting him in for a third-round pick is, like, patience working out at its absolute best. But again, how long does that last? They've been on this carousel of quarterbacks. Ideally, you could get maybe even 3 years out of them. Worst case scenario, this year's disappointing and you're turning around again. So they're a team that I really do like as a playoff team. It's so hard to say if they're a real contender for me, though, just because of the questions that only time will answer. So that's it.
So, doing this transition real quick, you were talking about getting less of the cap to cash and going this new kicking the can down. Is that just simply a changing of a mindset, a changing of a philosophy in negotiations, or is this something that you actually have to implement over a year or two, as far as, because right now everything's a real balancing act, everything's a real balancing act to make sure that we're never having any major holes and never too in debt. So is this just simply, you change your way you operate when you're negotiating, or is this something that takes a little bit of time to take place?
The negotiation aspect, it's basically, it's as simple as using our previous cash to cap tendencies as like a bottom line. Like, we can't do that because we don't do that, because precedent is a lot when it comes to negotiation. So all you're doing is just literally not saying that. So it doesn't really change your negotiation tactics per se. Like, it actually makes it easier for you. Really, what that will come down to is Jim Irsay saying, okay, our budget, which was this much, is now this much. Instead, because what you're ultimately doing is spending more money in a given year than what the cap dictates on a face value. Yeah. And so if you're spending 190 or spending 200 million in actual cash on players, now next year you're going to be spending 260. That's a $60 million increase in the actual budget spent. So he's the guy, like, he's the one. There's nobody else to point to but him, because everybody else in the organization can roll with that change and they'll be happy about it, because it means keeping the roster together with veterans who are proven, that they've drafted and developed. If not, then you just have to turn back to the draft. You have to flip some players for picks and kind of start over a little bit again,
Yep, and that's what is facing Ballard and Irsay right now, is that decision. Do you spend the money and push it down the line to keep these guys together in hopes for a Super Bowl run? Or do you just, rotate the guys in and out, and hopefully you can replace them with quality players? That's the biggest question right now.
I can tell you what Ballard thinks right now. I can give you his answer.
Well, guys, I appreciate you. Max, thanks so much for taking time out not only to join us here, but literally was here 45 minutes prior doing a breakdown of the Jets 2022 season outlook that we will be uploading tomorrow. Appreciate that very much. Why don't you tell everyone where they can find you, man?
Yeah, so real quick, you can find me on Twitter at @MaxDean. You can find me on YouTube at MaxDean is Football, where I talk about the NFL at large. I also have a Jets-specific channel as well, but I doubt there's any Jets fans here. You can also find me, I'm now writing for GridironHeroics.com, covering the Jets, but also talking about contract matters, talking about cap and stuff. So that's a new site if you want to go check it out. I'll be posting articles there pretty much daily. Guys, thank you so much for having me. I really, really do appreciate it, and I look forward to coming back and chatting about how the Colts address everything we talk about next year.
Absolutely. I mean, this is becoming an annual thing, and I think I like it, and I think we're going to keep it going because I think there's a lot of guys out there that actually enjoy the information that you provide. Loyalist, any final words?
No, I just, once again, thanks again. Guys, if you haven't been following Max after last year, what are you waiting on? Check it out.
All right. And until next time, I'm Lawrence Owen. This is Colts Law. That was Loyalist and MaxDean. And as usual, have a good one.
Just because a player's not a household name doesn't mean we can't make him a household name.
I love you, but don't you ever do that again. That is so wrong, man. So wrong. Don't tell people to leave my stream. What's wrong with you? Come on. Go tackle a running back and a quarterback. Don't tell people to leave my stream.